Wow, look at all these people come in. This is great. I see so many people that I know and a few that I've just seen on the Poets Corner that I don't know from outside the Poets Corner. But I want to welcome everybody this afternoon, and we're still admitting people. So while we admit people, if you want to just put where you're from in the chat, that would be great. It's always fun to see all the different locations that people join us from. Cooperstown, New York, Vancouver, California, South Georgia. Wow.
Damn.
San Francisco, Oregon, Ohio, Germany, Scotland.
Orkney.
Wow, from Florida, the Sunshine State. Oh, we've got sunshine here, finally, in Maine, a little bit. Of course, our readers are from all over. So I am going to get started. It's just after 4 o'clock, and I just want to make sure we have plenty of time for our readers in our program. I'm Meg Weston. I'm the founder and host of the Poets Corner, and I just want to welcome you to our Sunday reading series. Today we have our program on the lyric essay, and we haven't done a lot of prose readings. This is this wonderful intersection between poetry and prose that I think you'll really enjoy. And you'll hear from Jill Talbot, Elissa Washuta, Annaliese Jakimides, and Julie Marie Wade. My colleague Liz Cullick will be our host today, and she will introduce the program and these writers. But first, I'd just like to say a few words about upcoming events on the Poets Corner. Although almost all of our events take place over Zoom, there's a few in the local area, and we're in Mid-Coast, Maine. And I'd like to tell you about them just in case you're here or planning to visit. But in 2023, we hosted a chapbook contest, and the winner, Molly Bolton, will be here in Maine and reading from her beautiful prize-winning chapbook that was chosen by Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Marie Howe. She won this year's Pulitzer for poetry. Marie won't be here, but Molly will, and her chapbook is called What Blooms in the Dark. And she'll be joined by one of today's readers, poet, essayist, and artist Annaliese Jakimides. It's at Anodyne Books on the evening of June 19th, and there's more on our website about that. You might also check out the Blue Raven Poetry Series hosted in the Blue Raven Gallery in Rockland, Maine. This month's poets are Garrett Hongo with Lauren Wattell on June 25th. So back to the Poets Corner and Zoom. On Sunday, July 13th, our Sunday reading series will have the distinguished poet Arthur Z. reading from his 12th book of poetry called Into the Hush. He also has another new book that just came out in April called The White Orchard, Selected Interviews, Essays, and Poems. And I've been delving into both of those books, and they are just wonderful. You really won't want to miss it, and you can register on thepoetscorner.org. Then we don't schedule August usually, and we haven't scheduled anything, but looking forward to September. On Sunday, September 14th, we're hosting a reading that we're calling Recycled, Reinvented, and Reimagined from Compost to Creation. A reading with Mark Doty, Diane Seuss, and Melissa McKinstry. They'll be reading poems they once discarded, later rediscovered and reimagined, and talking about that process of revision. And on the following Sunday, September 21st, we have a craft talk on the lyric essay with Heidi Serwick. Heidi wrote the original book on the craft of the lyric essay. And especially after today's reading, I think you'll want to sign up for that craft talk in September. So there's a lot that you won't want to miss on the Poets Corner, but I also don't want to take a moment more away from today's program. So I'll welcome my colleague, our strategy and design director on the Poets Corner, Liz Collick.
Thanks, Meg. Hi, everyone. So the lyric essay, been around for a very, very, very long time, but it kind of came into the fore and was named by essayist and poet Deborah Tall in the 90s. And she defined it in the Seneca Review as the lyric essay takes from the prose poem in its density and shapeliness, its distillation of ideas and musicality of language. And I remember reading that in the issue when it came out and thinking, wow, that's like you're bringing two things into proximity to each other, and whether they cross or just veer past each other makes it for an interesting presentation. So the last few years, the medium's become increasingly popular. More writers have been experimenting with that shape-shifting quality, the expansiveness of form and meaning, and a focus on patterns and rhythm, sound, and imagery. And so this hybrid form of prose writing sometimes resembles poetry. It can often employ an unusual structure. It can include visuals. It relies on imagery and imagination, much more than narrative. And I find it typically delivers the reader a sensory experience with a real focus on the beauty of language and how beautiful language can be. So today we've got 4 essay writers who are going to share their work with us. And we're going to begin with Jill Talbot, who's Associate Professor of Creative Writing and a University Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of North Texas. She's the author of The Last Year Essays, which was the winner of the Wandering Angus, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Press Editors Prize in August 2023. She's also the author of The Way We Weren't, a memoir from Soft Skull, and Loaded, Women in Addiction, a collection of personal essays. Welcome, Jill.
Hi, thank you so much. And hello, everyone out there. I'm going to be reading 2 short essays today, and I chose them because they are different tonally and the way in which they engage with lyricism. And the first one is Of Seasons. Long past August in Texas, the heat hangs on, a stubborn guest. Outside, the trees, their branches heavy with green, sweep in the wind. No signs of autumn, no ochre, butterscotch rust, no sounds of onion skin crunch, only sweat and swelter, a suffocation. I lean against the doorframe to my porch, weary. A year ago, I stood here talking on the phone with my mother, the two of us misunderstanding each other. Virginia Woolf described autumn this way. The nights now are full of wind and destruction. The trees plunge and bend and their leaves fly helter-skelter until the lawn is plastered with them. And they lie packed in gutters and choke rain pipes and scatter damp paths. There is no light in my closet, no switch, no bulb, no chain. I am tired of the movements I make and make again, how I take the left turn on Hickory, how I come home to find that I forgot to start the dishwasher, how I pour a glass of wine at 6, how I sort through the mail and throw most of it away, how I exchange the paper towel tube with a new roll, how I leap over the swelling stream of water in the parking lot outside my apartment as it storms, how I turn the comforter back on my bed hours before I get into it, and how I finger the soil of the hanging baskets on the porch, their pink periwinkles still cascading in October. Tonight, another obligation to check off the calendar. I set my wine glass on the end table and step to my room, open the closet. Once in a letter, Woolf realized I meant to write about death, only life came breaking in as usual. A black dress, sleeveless, a dry cleaner tag pinned to the inside of its collar. I pull it from its slot between a pair of jeans and a gray skirt. The dress slips and drops to the floor. My fingers find it among the shoes. Last week, I hesitated before taking the dress into the cleaners. I sat in my car, counting the months back to April, pressing the heavy fabric to my face, taking a deep breath, remembering how spring had drawn a sudden curtain of gray and drizzle and cold, how I teetered on the damp path toward a silver casket, how every mourner, including the preacher, offered a coat to my quiet refusals. My father already in the ground. Grief lingers, a stubborn guest. I bend toward the back of my closet for the black pumps and pull them from the dark. When I stand, I notice a crust of caked mud on the first inch of each heel. Plunge. The shoes like wilted flowers in my hands, and I remember the way my sharp heels sunk into the ground with each step I took toward my mother's casket. At the kitchen sink, I run the water. I wipe the mud away with a paper towel. Each sweep of my hand, each removal, a betrayal. Before I was referred to as a lyric essayist, I noticed people noting a certain quality, grit, in my work or in my voice. And so I wanted to read one of those because I think it's interesting how lyricism can often contain that kind of gritty edge to it. So this started as an index of recurring images in my work, and does serve as the index for a manuscript of lyric essays, all brief essays, as this one is. This is called Toward a Country and Western Song. Bottle of Gold. Swigs on a cracky edge above a lake in New Mexico, a closed curtain of stars. The bourbon in a brown paper sack tucked into a shoebox in my grandmother's closet. Tossing shots of fire flakes in an Oklahoma bar, then wandering home through the grass, barefoot, the prickle of those sprinkler damp blades while I followed a boy I loved immediately, a boy I love still because he died before I could dare every question. Chardonnay, Chardonnay, Chardonnay. Empty streets. A late October, drifting down Holland Drive to a bar called Railroad Blues, the wail and shudder of a train racing the Texas night, a bend in the road of a small Colorado town lined with blue spruce and ponderosa pine, sudden rain. Rumbling in a black truck down the dirt road of a border town, all those shadows and door frames staring. State Road 9 lined by the red rocks of southern Utah. Highway 84 toward Lubbock, where the horizon's a razor, where the pump oil jacks lull the landscape. Porch. A top step in Utah, 3 in the morning, a crumpled pack of smokes and the sprinkler sputtering. I watched the water roam the yard and wondered why the blue truck next door never moved. Outside a back door in Fort Collins, a dusty green recliner, a chimenea, the burning pinon wood that smelled like desert and leather, whispers from a wind chime and a snow ring around the moon. The back one of my childhood home, the welcome to the porch sign my mother hung, how it fell after she died, and no matter how many times I secured the sawtooth hangers, it refused to hold. Dust. A walk from elementary school in West Texas, grit in my teeth, swirls of sand collecting on every corner, an orange haboob hovering. A campfire's trembling shadow on the limestone walls of Big Bend, my skin sabulous, stretched taut from the cloud kicked up by my tires and the glare of a full day's sun. A bearded guitar player from a town called Marathon, where storefront signs creak in the wind. The rear view on a road, through the twisting towers beyond Tucson, a sandstone squeeze. All my misgivings that follow me in and out of every town. Corners. The one on 7th Avenue Dean rounds in the last pages of On the Road, bent to it again. A window in an adobe house in New Mexico, the thick trunk tree outside, its leafy branches that wept on the corrugated roof when it rained. The yellow jukebox in that Boulder bar the night I knew he and I wouldn't last. A house I'd wander from in the middle of the night to the middle of the intersection, the traffic light changing for no one. The black-jacketed man at the gas station who removed his hat as the hearse carrying my father turned. Payphones. A gas station in Lubbock after a day-long drive, when I pressed silver buttons under the glare of the lights, the cotton field's edge. 380 West, 40 miles from the nearest town after a rental broke down, searing heat, the sting of concrete, the way I stopped there again years later to find only rusted bolts in the sidewalk. The one outside the liquor store on Route 11 in New York, its black handset dangling as if someone were on the line. A standalone across from the second-story apartment I rented in my 20s, how it rang each afternoon, how I once crossed the street to answer, then heard the hang-up just as I said, hello? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jill. Up next, we have Elissa Washuta. She's a member of the Cowlitz Indian Tribe of Washington State. And her essay collection, White Magic, was selected as a finalist for the PEN Open Book Award and longlisted for the PEN Gene Stein Award, and named among the best books of 2021 by Time, the New York Public Library, and NPR. She's also the author of My Body is a Book of Rules and Starvation Mode, and with Teresa Warburton, she co-edited the anthology Shapes of Native Nonfiction, collected essays by contemporary writers. Elissa's honors include a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Creative Capital Award, and the Artist Trust Arts Innovator Award. She's an associate professor at the Ohio State University, where she teaches in the MFA program in creative writing. Welcome, Elissa.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's so great to be here. I'm so excited to hear these writers read and to get to visit with you all on a Sunday afternoon. I'm going to read from 2 essays from 2 books. I'm first going to read from My Body is a Book of Rules, which is my first book. I always say, every time I read from it, I say it's going to be the last time. It's been a very long time since I've read from it. It came out in 2014. And I want to read from this book as well as my most recent book, White Magic, to kind of show the evolution of my approach to the lyric essay over time. Um, so what I'm going to read to you from My Body is a Book of Rules. I'll just read for a few minutes from an essay called Many Famous People Suffer from Bipolar Disorder. And this actually started as a poem. And it was one of the last poems I ever wrote, the last poem I ever finished, I guess. And switched to prose after writing it, basically, and then later fashioned it into an essay for this book. I'm going to skip the first section. It's a little bit long, and get into the second section. And all you need to know is that the Kurt I'm referring to is Kurt Cobain. The patient may feel sad, blue, or down in the dumps. For so long, Kurt could only see drizzle and fog, the pale hair that hid his chlorine eyes, only moved through his world of calloused fingers, shredded jeans, evergreen trees. Some say the weather in Washington makes people want to die, but his problem was the storm in his stomach, the misfiring lightning in his head. Sadness isn't the word. Maybe oversaturated blood churning, maybe brain bleeding, eye knives, psychic head wound, asbestos innards, polluted Puget Sound pooling in his bed. Being famous, creative, and rich looks easy, but that isn't true. Everyone knows this. Kurt's bipolar brain was cloudy, blooming with blue-green algae, rich with phosphorus, with fish corpses floating to the surface. People say celebrity is a monster or intelligence is. They say it makes you feel things you shouldn't feel, know things like some oracle. Not true. The disorder killed Kurt. Genes, circuitry, abnormal anatomy, and then the kindling effect when every episode added to the burning down of the house in his head. A person doesn't have to be famous or brilliant to be fucked up. She can be completely insignificant. 24 with useless degrees from respected universities, 39 pairs of sneakers, no substance abuse problems. Well, that's interesting. Anyway, and very few Google search results. Before the fame hit and after, Kurt was ill. Every high and low was tethered to his spine when he tried to die in Rome, and the pain rocking the tender spine surrounded his stony vertebrae, pinned him to a plan. A few weeks later, in sunny LA, he hatched a new plan, climbed a 6-foot fence that was keeping him in rehab, and went back home to die. Just going to read one more section from this. Many who suffer from depression and bipolar disorder self-medicate with street drugs and alcohol. The heroin addiction was on purpose, he said. His stomach killed. By 1992, he really did seem to be dying. In photo shoots, every shot captured his last breath. The camera's blinking eye caught him sleeping, his face softened into the clay features of a 4-year-old boy. He was becoming an embryo, Melon's stomach melting into sandy brown bays. A river was born at the summit of his syringe, and through water he saw his arms around the stout chest of a tree, splattered Easter eggs at his feet. A child ran from him, could have been his brother, his father. Did he have either? He thought that was the problem until he slipped far enough under to converse with his misfiring synapses. Then a flash bulb reminded him that he needed to tell the world that he was still breathing. Under gray stars, his sonogram eyes saw the sun turn blue, and he awoke. I was surprised at the substance abuse line because this book is in part about getting sober. I guess it took me a while to figure that out. Okay, so I'm going to read next just a few sections from from White Magic, which came out in 2021. And this chapter essay is called The Spirit Corridor. And I'm going to skip around a little bit. Here's a riddle. You're standing in front of two doors. One leads to heaven, the other to hell. A guardian stands in front of each. One guardian always tells the truth, the other always lies. You don't know which is which. You want the door to heaven, but you can ask only a single question to one guardian. What is the question? I don't know and I don't care. I've been looking for a different door. Dream door. I think dreams are riddles because they need to be solved. I am sure dreams are enigmas because they really can't be. After I read the book, The Battle for the Castle, Elizabeth Winthrop's sequel to The Castle in the Attic, sorry, these are mentioned earlier in the essay, in which the hero and his friend defend their castle from attack by large rats, I begin dreaming I was in a besieged castle. I never dream I'm naked, flying, or falling. In my nightmares, I don't have long before the people outside the walls come to kill me. Elephant House door. I was prepared to see books as riddles long before high school teachers taught me the mode of literary study I'd have to unlearn, searching texts for the single correct interpretation coded in symbols and subtext. In one of my favorite childhood books, there really was a solution. The 11th Hour, A Curious Mystery, is a picture book by Graham Base in which an elephant named Horace throws a party for his 11th birthday. He invites 10 animal friends to his house, plans 11 games, and prepares a feast to be served at 11 o'clock. But the guests arrive to the banquet hall to find the food already eaten. Readers are tasked with identifying the thief using a little close observation and some simple deduction. The solution is in a sealed section at the book's end, following a warning. Do not turn this page until you have tried your hardest to unravel the mystery, for the getting of wisdom is no match for the thrill of the chase, and those who choose the longer road shall reap their reward. Clues are encoded in basic cryptography in every illustration. Watch the clocks lettered into the wrought iron of the property's entry gate. Red herring spelled out on fallen tennis balls. Put no trust in hidden codes and messages decoded from symbols substituted for letters. A verse visible when the book is held up to a mirror. Yea, all who seek take heed, forsooth, for everyone has told the truth. Technically, that is factual, but someone is lying, of course, by omission. The 11th Hour, I Spy, Where's Waldo, Magic Eye. I wanted all books to make me feel the way these did when my whole body and brain lurched with the click of visual recognition. I still do. I want the whole world to make me feel it. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Elissa. Up next, we have our one main writer, Annaliese Jakimides in Bangor. Annaliese shows up every day to write about people and place and about the narratives of our lives in both prose and poetry, the world of the real and the world of the imaginary. Her work has been published in journals and magazines, including the Beloit Poetry Journal, Utne Reader, Decor Maine, and GQ, as well as in anthologies such as Breaking Bread, Essays from New England, On Food, Hunger, on Family, and Rivers of Ink, Literary Reflections on the Penobscot. She's been cited in national competitions, most recently as a finalist for the Stephen Dunn Poetry Prize, and nominated for the Pushcart Prize and Best of the Net. And her work has been broadcast on NPR and MPBN. Welcome, Annaliese.
Well, thank you very much. And it's an honor to be here with all of these voices. when people were speaking earlier about their earlier work or reading sections from things, it occurred to me for the very first time that I probably cut my writing teeth on flash lyric essays, hundreds of them, long before anybody was calling them that, because there was this daring editor at a weekly newspaper in northern Maine who let me do that. And so with great gratitude to Doug Fletcher, I acknowledge that. This is an essay called A Life in Yesterdays. Yesterday, I moved all of me, everything I had been and could become, my childhood and girlhood, my new womanhood, everything I knew, had experienced, consumed, internalized, learned in the big city, all the words and markings, phrases, the club nights of Mingus and Coltrane, Archie Shepp, Stanton Davis, Richie Havens before he got his teeth, Joan Baez, only the second woman I'd seen up close live, doing what she wanted. The huge, whole, enormous, multidimensional, cross-cultural, racial, raceless world I lived in and loved in and loved. I moved it all to the land. Yesterday, I moved to the land. I moved me to the land. Not long before yesterday, my dad had moved to this land, as in home of the free and the brave. Kicked out of his land, the land where he grew up, where his family had lived for generations, along a seashore, in a land across an ocean I will never see. Someone was kicked out of this land too, sometime before. Yesterday, I began to live on the land that was not our land, to live off the land that had been someone else's before we made it ours with a deed and some money. I had never grown even a daffodil, and now I was going to grow everything we ate, except rice and the whole wheat berries that I would grind to make the flour to bake fresh bread. I had never baked bread. I had never ground berries. Yesterday, I got a grinder. Yesterday, I built a house. Well, not alone, not the bread or the house. Yesterday, I learned we don't do anything alone. Yesterday, I stood under a bowl of star sky cracked ribbons of altar time in past and future lives, a necklace of love cascading along my clavicle, a sweetness and sourness, a umami of everything to come, calm on my tongue. Yesterday, I made a family, first of one, and then two, three, 4, and yes, 5. I am one of those numbers. Yesterday, I learned to count myself. Yesterday, I laughed, sitting by the pond on a ratty old blanket with 90-year-old Lil and a passel of kids in the heat of a black-flied summer. I drank rum and coke with Marge and Dick, whose teenage boys taught me how to plant and harvest, to preserve, to hang around campfires, telling and listening and laughing. Yesterday, I knew there's something I'm here to do, be, lift, open, about, around, a moth caught in the sway of all this. Yesterday, the Pentecostal Methodist Catholic Baptist couple who fights against people who love people they don't think they should love, like gay and black, which was then lowercase, and trans, which wasn't acknowledged at all yet, gave me my first typewriter so I could write about loving everybody. Will and Polly and I thumbtack notes on the bulletin board outside the IGA, advocating different positions, different beliefs. This was never, however, a war. There was no war on our land, in our land, over our land, just difference. They were lovely. Yesterday we knew, or I knew, maybe all of us knew what it was to be human. Yesterday I realized some may forget, but we can always remember. Yesterday, I drove into blue, black, gray, white, orchid, bruised plum fragments and plumes from horizon to horizon, a dome of marvels, my face up in the clouds. Sure, dread or fear or sorrow had no place in my days. Yesterday, I lost number 5. Yesterday, I couldn't figure out how to make my own joy. The ingredients were missing, like a cake with no flour. Yesterday, Laura gave me 2 flats of marigolds I couldn't pay for from her little greenhouse attached to her little house at the crest of Bumpus Hill, where the winds swipe you off the road. She told me how to turn them into golden light, even though I was an atheist and she had a strict Lord. Yesterday, my mouth was a nursery, steamy and fertile. Under my tongue, a sequin of rain pooled each night, harvesting what most people think must be the specter of heartbreak or heart loss, heartache, something heart indefinable but painful in body speak. But body speak is no longer my chosen language. Heart, only the container of all this presence. Yesterday, I listened. Yesterday, I listened to wind and skin, to flower and lizard and ant on the ground. Yesterday, I listened to a world alive with dying, but that doesn't mean what some say. Don't ignore. The cathedral is still spinning its circles. Yesterday, someone else's boy took his life. Yesterday, I packed up Edna St. Vincent Millay and Charlie Simic, Betsy Scholl, Major Jackson, Lydia Davis, Andre Veloz, Miles Davis, Stravinsky, and Martha and the Vandellas, and drove away from the land my children called home, where I learned to cook, bake bread, be seen, write, see, grow, listen, dress, dance, live, love like no one is watching, where I learned that everyone is always doing the best they can, or they'd be doing better. Yesterday, I saw you. Yesterday, you saw me. Yesterday, we were both seen. Yesterday, I woke with the opportunity to write the questions, or was it the answers? I was told the morning I learned how to whistle in open air. Toggling now between safety and salvation, I drive into morning, the sun leaky along the ridge of restless spring limbs, a beautiful thing the fantasy of time cannot take away, shadow of shed skin raining down. I lean out the window, drawing lines through space, and watch all the bodies floating home. Yesterday, words opened, letters dropped out, floated on, settled into a fissure of understanding. Yesterday, I asked myself what I wanted to learn of tenderness. Yesterday, I told someone that love is all there is, that we're always moving toward joy. Yesterday, someone told me I was crazy. Yesterday, I learned that my dad didn't just move to this land as in home of the free and the brave, kicked out of his land, the land where he grew up, where his family had lived for generations along a seashore, in a land across an ocean I will never see. No one had ever before said the words genocide or murder or refugee, told a quieted version to set me free, and I'm grateful, although some may not be. Not to be strapped my whole life to the story of the wizened hands clutching the side of the rocking boat until the knife or machete or whatever released the great aunt someone to the blackened sea. Yesterday, I smelled lemony smoke. My mother used to sit at her blue-clothed maple kitchen table, smoking Newport cigarettes, reading romance novels, baking sweets in the old gas oven she had to light with a match while pigeons cooed beyond the open door in a thin, misty gauze. Yesterday, a body passed by me, whispering directions. People leave and forget to tell each other. Temptation never adds up. Whole species die and no one notices. These days, gastric breeding frogs and the dusky seaside sparrow, no sooner found than gone, the Antioch shieldback katydid. Did you really think I would miss the oar under your breath, the pinnals of wing feathers sprouting through the black ice of your skin, the breeze? Yesterday, I saw small hinged bones, voices circling the feet, my feet, your feet, our feet, the once again miracle of morning, all the scars and the brackish waves of light, everything moving closer to love. Circling into the world while walking back into myself, then falling into open arms. What can be said except thank you? Yesterday, the universe told me how it works. So surprising that I would be the recipient of that story information I find amazing, impossible. Yesterday, I opened the door, or you opened the door, someone opened the door, and there you were, the book of wild delights balanced on your invisible palm. Yesterday, I told a story, sang a song, walked on the land, danced like no one was watching. Yesterday, I was grateful, so fucking grateful that everyone is still here. Thank you.
Thanks, Annaliese. Julie Marie Wade. Julie writes and publishes poetry, prose, and hybrid forms. Her most recent and forthcoming collections include The Merry Years from Texas Review Press, selected by Michael Martone for the 2023 Clay Reynolds Novella Prize, and Quick Change Artist Poems by Aninga Press 2025, selected by Octavio Quintanilla for the 2023 Aninga Prize in Poetry, and Fisk by Anthology from Cutbank Prose Chapbook Series. A finalist for the National Poetry Series and a winner of the Lambda Literary Award for Lesbian Memoir, Wade teaches in the creative writing program at Florida International University in Miami and makes her home with Angie Griffin and their 2 cats in Dania Beach. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you, Meg, for including the lyric essay in this program. This is one of my favorite subjects to talk about, and these are some of my favorite readers to hear. I am going to read from the book that Liz mentioned called The Merry Years. If you're a Mary Tyler Moore Show fan by chance, then you might recognize the cover. I am a longtime Mary Tyler Moore Show fan since 1992, so second run viewer, but ever since 1992. And this project is sort of connected to a more recent way of thinking about the lyric essay for me. I am working on developing a new graduate seminar on the new ekphrasis. And I've been thinking about how, as a young poet, like in high school and college, one of the things we encountered was this idea of the ekphrastic poem. And it was always kind of short, relatively speaking, very concentrated on typically like one work of art that was usually already recognized as a work of art, like the poet. I'm thinking of, John Keats visiting the British Museum and writing Ode on a Grecian Urn, and this kind of really rich description where you picture the poet in a gallery space or a museum space, and there's this already acknowledged work of art in front of them. And I've been really interested in how a lot of prose writers or hybrid writers have been sort of expanding, sometimes even into whole books, that impulse to make an ekphrastic poem, but to respond to more popular culture like television and film. And I've had students do ekphrastic work with video games and visual novels, and they're the ones choosing, right? Like the texts that really matter to them. And so I thought, well, if I care about how the ekphrastic poem is blossoming into, these ekphrastic kinds of essays and book projects, then I've got to lean into like, what are those touchstone texts for me? So I sometimes talk about The Merry Years as a memoir of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, but it's also televisual ekphrasis of a kind. And so I am going to read 2 sort of parallel sections. They're each about 3.5 minutes long. So in that sense, they're still borrowing from that density and compression of the ekphrastic poem. And I was really excited to hear everything I heard, but that Elissa was also working with the ekphrastic impulse. So the opening of the book is called, the first chapter is Opening Credits. And this is kind of just a more classic, like ekphrastic reading of the opening credits of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. So if you've seen the Mary Tyler Moore Show, you will recognize some of the images from the montage. And if you have not, this is your introduction. She isn't smiling when it begins. This is important to remember. Her eyes are wide, watchful, and the way she touches her tongue to the roof of her mouth suggests she may be staving off tears. The road ahead unfolds toward the city, 2 cities, twins, and she must choose between them. Make the right choice, Mary. One city already has a saint. She will become patron of the other, Saint Mary of Minneapolis. Her eyes follow the road, follow the exit signs, but her mind is far away, is flashing back to Roseburg. This is important to remember. The past is always with us, no matter who we are. They threw a party for her, the co-workers at her last job, her friends. We never learn much about that before life, though we know Mary must have been loved. Past's prologue. Past is always prologue, Mary. On CBS in the 70s as much as in Shakespeare's time. This is important to remember. There's a sign that reads, "Good luck, Mary," but she won't need it. She has her work ethic, her practicality, and her pluck. Someone uncorks a bottle of champagne. Red roses, a parting gift, resemble Miss America's bouquet. And Mary is our Miss America all grown up, isn't she? Or at least our Miss American Midwest. There's joy in the flashback and sadness too, but goodbye is just the shadow of hello. This is important to remember. Mary drives a Mustang after all, hinting at the wild horse within. When we see her next, she's walking, a woman alone in winter, no man steering her by the elbow or warming her with his embrace. Saint Mary of perambulation. It's cold, but she's not daunted by the weather. She strides bare-legged in her knee-high boots, her knee-length coat. She carries her groceries home from the store, a certain spring in her step, a loaf of bread bouncing on top of her brown paper bag. Mary is beginning to smile now, to feel herself part of something larger, subsumed in the corner crowd. She wears a tam or tammy hat, which is a woman's variant of the tam o' shanter worn by men. Mary is like this, pleasant and appropriate, but slyly subversive too. Our Lady of Surprises, Our Lady of more than what she seems. Not the type to draw attention to herself, it takes an extraordinary surge, this independence, this freedom at last, to prompt the twirl, the tossing of her tam into the air. An older woman looks on, envious or admiring, or perhaps recalling a day when she did the same. Saint Mary of maybes, Saint Mary of anything is possible now. We at home have crossed ourselves. We genuflect by screen glow. We will follow wherever she goes, Our Lady of the Smile. And in a later part of this memoir in the Mary Tyler Moore Show, because I had a very, very sheltered childhood, and the Mary Tyler Moore Show sort of slipped in there because of Nick at Night as an appropriate viewing. But for me, it was actually really radical viewing because most of what else I was watching felt even safer. A lot of Leave It to Beaver in there, a lot of Donna Reed Show in there. And so this was the first, sort of truly autonomous woman that I had ever seen and followed, through 168 episodes over and over again. So years and years later, my circumstances were a little bit different, but my partner and I were leaving Washington State where we met and where I had grown up and the only place I had ever been. And we were driving all the way to Pittsburgh, about 2,500 miles away, to a state where we knew absolutely no one. And so that section of the book is called Pittsburgh Was My Minneapolis. And there are visuals, like we mentioned earlier, so I was able to use a lot of extra text kind of materials, but this small section is a retelling of those opening credits with my own life in it. And also because of songwriting credits and copyright laws, I had to be very careful with how much of the original Mary Tyler Moore theme song I could use. And so that I hope, prompted additional creativity with rendering this. This section is called There Are 446 Bridges in Pittsburgh, and Mary Richards is one of them. Scene opens with an aerial view of Pittsburgh, taken from Mount Washington. The triangle shape of the city is visible, along with many of the bridges, and prominent in the foreground is the iconic red tram of the Duquesne Incline inching its way up the hill. Cut to a silver station wagon with Washington plates plunging into the Fort Pitt Tunnel as cue theme song. The iconic MTM opening low blast and echo of a solo trombone, a horn like a big rigged truck, clashes with jazz trumpet traffic blare. The disconcerting call and response, followed quickly by a pure baritone male vocalist, still youthful but definitely adult and questioning, backed by soft 70s style electric guitar and sparse bongo. The lyrics are concerned, worldly, haunted. Close up on the faces of two young women in the front seat of that car as they exit the tunnel, then pan out to show the confluence of the three rivers. The station wagon heads east on Interstate 376. The electric guitar turns acoustic, melancholy made melodic by the addition of a soft backup brass section and riffing sax, passing the downtown skyscrapers. There's a big world out there. Make note the PPG building that looks like a glass castle, crenellated at the top. Cut to the apartment in Squirrel Hill with the tall windows and the wood floors. Let the camera sweep past the tiny bedroom in the back, showing only one bed, cozy with blue quilt and green blanket, and the wicker IKEA chair in the corner. The theme song's beat slowly starts to liven as the lyrics speak of living. It's time now, and you should know it. Now the partners are in the kitchen pulling their first Thanksgiving turkey from the oven. The brass swells toward a building crescendo. Love is all around. They're running together down the steep slope of Panther Hollow in their summer clothes, tank tops, shorts, try to pick up the purple hue of the heat as the air seems to swaddle the trees, then transition to the partners still running, but now in their winter clothes, fleeces, gloves, tights, as they pass through Shenley Park and alongside the stunning Phipps Conservatory in sync with brightening lyrics about giving. Now they're in their work clothes on the city bus, standing and gazing out the window as they approach the Cathedral of Learning. Lyrics soaring, almost light now, as the camera takes in the magnificence of this Gothic structure, students and tourists alike flooding the doors, carpe diem, the partners getting coffee at Kiva Han. Each phrase guides the transition of camera shots to a letter in the mailbox, Julie's key turning the lock, and then her hand reaching inside. In the final transition, she's running up the stairs outside the Mellon Institute, where Angie has just stepped outside. Julie's waving the letter, and we can see that she's been admitted to a PhD program in Louisville. The vocals climax with the instrumentals, trumpets ecstatic now as they embrace at the base of one of those dramatic columns. They can make it after all. It's winter and they're both wearing swing coats. Julie puts her hands into Angie's pockets and they're kissing, leaning against the column. Then, without notice, the music fades abruptly behind a sudden xylophone. There it is again, and like an ellipses, we're left breathless at those 4 quick crystal notes. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. So the reading part of the afternoon we're done with, but really want to engage these writers in a conversation about how they got here. I know many of you started as poets, maybe didn't start, but many of you have been writing poetry. And if any of you want to jump in and talk to us about how you found your way into the lyric essay, whether you came from poetry, whether you came from down the street elsewhere, I'd love to hear some of your stories. Anybody can jump right in. Okay, I'm going to have to call a name. And I will.
Well, I'll start then if nobody else is going to start. You guys have so much more insight into the lyric essay than I do. I'm not a teacher of any of this. So, that sense of the inner workings of the structure is not mine. But I will say that I came to it largely because what rises insists on its form. So I make mixed media work. I still write poetry, essay, fiction, flash fiction, and it's just I live outside of an ability to categorize things or box them. So it just is how it evolves for me. It's just the language, and things show up and they're there, and I let them be who they are, much like I'm grateful my mother let me be who I was. So.
Anybody else want to talk about how you came into writing in this style?
I'll say this. I was one of those kids who always said I was a poet when people asked, tell me about you. But I didn't actually write any poems. So there was really nothing like to back this up at all. It was just a mindset. Like, I think I see the world like a poet. But I was mostly writing a lot of really long prose fiction type things, but just seeing myself as a poet. And I think I ended up in the terrain of the lyric essay like at exactly the right time, because I went to college the year that Deborah Tall coined the term and put a spotlight on it. And I went to a college that was offering all of these creative nonfiction classes. They weren't exactly calling them that, they were calling them autobiographical writing, but I was like in a moment where that was really being celebrated, like the more experimental, the better. And I was also hiding from the one poetry professor on campus who I felt did not like my work. And so due to this encounter in my English 101 class, I didn't want to take poetry workshop with him because I was very intimidated. So I just kept taking all these autobiographical writing and imaginative writing classes, which kind of like what Annaliese was saying, there just was no specific genre. It was just imaginative writing. So it was really, really open. And that was a wonderful place to be in the late 90s, just writing whatever you wanted, and having nobody tell you that it was outside the genre parameters. And I don't know if I had been brave and taken those poetry classes, if I would have been allowed to do that at the time. So, so I came the via negativa back to poetry later.
Oh, so you went into that, the whole imaginary writing, and then kind of veered back into poetry, even though you had been calling yourself a poet the whole time.
Yes, I applied to grad school very audaciously as a poet, because a lot of programs didn't have creative nonfiction tracks yet. So I went to grad school as a poet, but hadn't been studying poetry, and then just kept finding the lyric essay everywhere, or maybe it was finding me too. And so I think those two parts of my life now are very braided together, the poetry and the lyric essay.
Yeah. I think the thing that's so intriguing about this genre is that it's created out of this idea of how imagery is translated into word and back again into the imagery. So many of the things that you all read today conjure up such clear visuals, and then there's also this weave of narrative that pulls you back in and pushes you back out. I'm thinking, Julie, about something that you wrote that's in the back of the A Harp in the Stars anthology, about how you think of the lyric essay as a lily pad, and that it's floating on the surface and yet it's tethered to the ground, but we don't see those roots. So yeah, it's beautiful.
Liz, it's Meg. I have a couple of questions
Yeah.
from the chat, if this is a good time to
Mhm.
insert them, but I also have one on my own because I'm just curious, and particularly this came up for me when Jill was reading, but that there is a narrative in all of these pieces, but it's loosely held. It's very different, and it's created, it seems to me, by this layering of images rather than some other kind of structure. So my first question that it is to Jill. Could you speak a little bit about how you think about narrative in a lyric essay?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I wanted to be honest about how surprised I was when I received the invitation to join this panel, because I thought there are so many wonderful lyric essayists. And my immediately thought was Leah Purpura and something that she says about lyric essayists. So if you don't mind, I just wanted to
Sure.
and I'll put the source in the chat here in a minute, but this is from a wonderful anthology called Bending Genre, and Purpura, a wonderful lyric essayist, writes in her chapter, some people are amused to find they write a thing called the lyric essay, when all along they were just doing what felt natural, simply asserting the sum total of who they are as writers. And that's kind of the camp I'm in, of when I'm identified as a lyric essayist. I'm surprised, I'm also humbled, but I think I got lucky in terms of, and I'm going to take a circuitous path to answer your question, but briefly. I too, like Julie, I remember the word you used, Julie, about when you applied to grad school as a poet. It was something about audacious or something like that.
I do feel like it was audacious.
Yeah,
Because I had
same,
no
same,
formal training.
same. But I came to graduate school in creative writing as a second master's after I had a PhD in American literature. And because I started scribbling poems during my PhD and took a couple of classes. But so I had a poetry thesis done, and then I needed one more workshop, had no idea what creative nonfiction was. And luckily, the only text for that and the focus of that class was the personal essay, using Philip Lopate's The Art of the Personal Essay. So my first assignment and my first essay was to write an imitation of Seneca's On Noise. When I say I was lucky, it's that I was not introduced to the essay as a narrative. I was introduced to the essay in the tradition, the Montaigne tradition, right, of following the train of thought, right, of the essayist, the mind at work on the page. And so when I think about writing in the mode of the lyric, which sometimes I'm not, I'm thinking more about narrative or place-based writing. But when I think about the narrative's role in the lyric is more of a, and this goes back to Deborah Tall's description, the mere mention, right? And so not having to ground the reader or give all the context and the backstory, but just enough that the reader feels grounded. But there's also a lot of mystery and omissions. And so, for example, when I was pausing in that first essay, those long pauses, that was white space on the page between the sections of prose. But there was a moment, it's interesting, Meg, when you ask about how I consider narrative, there was a moment when I was reading from the Toward a Country and Western Song that I thought, hopefully, this essay can't work as just a collage of images. I have to periodically insert some kind of story or memory or moment so that the reader can be placed somewhere, on a road, at a payphone, at a gas station. So I think it's about allowing yourself to not have to give all the details, but just hinting at it. And I really like the lily pad description of there's something under the surface, and leaving the reader room. I hope that answers the question.
Oh,
Meg.
it was wonderful answer. And I'm sure some other people might want to chime in on that. And if not, I've got a couple of craft questions from the chat, but maybe I'll just throw one in here because you mentioned the white space on the page and how you conveyed it in your reading. And somebody, Audrey, is asking, they said mixed media has been mentioned several times. Would anybody be willing to show us the visual portion or an example of one of your lyric essays? And I don't know if that's something that we can do here, but we can
Do it
certainly.
in a
No,
low
I'll
tech
just,
way.
Great.
I've got, oh, it's not going to focus correctly, but it doesn't matter. I mean, I think of my first book as being super visual in many ways. I think so. I'm gonna find what I just read from. Okay, what I just read from is I would say kind of like the standard like it's not focusing, is it? The standard
You can see it.
kind of formal approach that I use. You can just see that there's like paragraphs and they have headings. So
Yeah.
that's something that like kind of remains in my work. But I've always been really interested in the way the work looks on the page, and especially in the gaps as a, a way for the reader to, I think of like the gaps between segments as being a pause, but also um, what actually got me thinking about gaps was before I wrote lyric essay, I mean, as long as I've written nonfiction, it's always been lyric essay. That's kind of what I came upon first. And but before that, I was writing fiction. I happened to get a chance to sit in on a George Saunders class, one of his graduate classes. It's a long, really silly story, but I was just floored, and he said something about section endings in short stories, about having the momentum to kind of jump over the gap to the next section. I held that with me at the same time that I was starting to read and write, you know, uh, just like nonfiction. Um, I wasn't in grad school yet. I wasn't learning about nonfiction yet, but I was just trying to make essays that had those, like, as many of those jumps as possible across gaps because it seemed so cool. And you could write a really cool line that ended a little section and just, keep doing that over and over. Um, I don't remember where I was going with that, but I guess I also think of it as sort of like, a bell that rings across that gap into the next section. And so thinking about, when I was choosing sections to read for today, I was thinking about the um like the sort of nesting of lyric and narrative. I I put a link in the chat for the Deborah Tall's piece on the lyric essay that has been referred to a few times, which I had pulled up because I knew I was going to want to refer to it too, actually. there's, when I first started writing, when I was writing that poem, or turned that poem into, a part of my first book, I was thinking a lot more of lyricism in terms of language at the sentence level and at the level of image. And the more, the longer I've gone on, I think, I have a lot less time than I did in grad school, that's for sure. And I don't have time to, to polish every gem of a sentence as I go along. I just have to write something really messy, rough, and, sketched out. And that draws me a lot more to lyric essay as being, I'm thinking a lot more about the narrative than I am about, the fine grain of it, when I'm drafting. And that, of course, influences the end. But, I think that like that narrative, the overarching narrative of, a book of lyric essay for me, it's made up of, the tension rises and falls like, as in a novel, I think. That's how I map it out, as though I'm mapping out a novel. And but it's made of all these, sort of building blocks of narrative. And Julie, I loved what you said about ekphrasis, because I had not thought of it that way. It's and I love it. I want to talk to you more about it sometime. But just like all these different modes create the rising and falling of tension, and the kind of like plot of the mind moving through its subject matter, that so that, if you haven't read the Deborah Tall's definition, I really recommend it. It's amazing, and it gives, I think it's just so, it's such a powerful mode of writing, to be able to create this like luminous whole thing out of all these little pieces that are in some ways disparate, in some ways come together like magic. I think it's the coolest thing ever.
I love that enthusiasm. I think it's the coolest thing ever too. I've got one more from the chat, Liz, if I could
Yeah.
insert that here. Thomas is asking, does grief direct you to different creative pools, or has grief directed you to new creative pools? And I think both Alyssa and Jill wrote, well, Annaliese, you've all touched on it in different ways, grief as it informs the essays you wrote. Anybody want to, well, I would, I don't know if Jill, you want to take that one, because it was so prevalent in that first piece you read?
Sure. This goes back to the poetry workshops that I mentioned, that I took during my PhD work, but in literature. But the professor once said, well, two things he said that still stay with me and impact my writing. And the first was that everything that you write comes from what you've written before. So the poem, the essay, the story, the novel, whatever, would not exist if you had not written everything you had before. And that was the one thing. The other thing he said was, if you want to change your line, you have to change your life. And at the time, I had no idea what he was talking about. I was really out of my element in that class, and so I just nodded and smiled a lot. But grief changes the life, and it changes the line, regardless of genre. And since my parents passed, my essays veer toward that grief and it's not in any way something that I intend. It's just my essays turn a corner, and there they are, or there one of them is. But this particular, the first essay that I read, and I think about everything that I've written before that grief impacts the way I think about the grief and loss, and the stakes of that, of what I thought was grief or loss before versus what it is now. But that piece, and I'll tell something, I think it's really important for writers to think about what's significant about a moment for us is not necessarily the most significant thing for our readers. And where I was going that night when I needed to check something else off the calendar of obligations was I was receiving an award at my university. It was the first time that I had received accolades without my being able to call my parents and tell them. And when I left the auditorium or wherever it was, I had a panic attack and I couldn't move. I had to call a friend. I didn't know where I was. She said, "Where are you on campus?" I said, "I don't know. I don't know where I am." So when I wrote that essay, I didn't want to delve into anything but the surface of that evening and the discovery of the mud on the shoes, and thinking about the ways in which I needed to clean off those shoes and carry on, even though I didn't want to. So what the lyric allows me to do is just to focus on imagery of flowers and heat and paths, and being in conversation with Virginia Woolf, and going ahead and letting the reader know early, in that first segment, my mother and I struggled in our relationship and often miscommunicated. So I wanted to get a little bit of tension in there as well, right?
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that black dress. Annaliese?
I just like to say also that when you're talking about grief, which grief and loss, the intertwining of the two, it also resonates with me in that sense of how does that change your approach to writing in some way? And I would say that everything we do impacts everything else, consciously or not. And it applies to the writing as much as it applies to the making of art or to the relationships, and it all makes a difference, or at least that's how it works for me. So I'm a woman of many losses. The parents are gone, all the brothers gone, including the son at 21, and the extraordinary musician who was the love of my life. All of those kinds of things. But all of that for me has made me acutely aware of the light. So acutely aware of the light and following where the light takes me in my writing. And some of that, I will just say briefly, has to do with that, I believe, that sense for me, and not necessarily true of anybody else, is that having grown up in a working class inner city neighborhood of a large city, and being transported early on to a dirt road of a town of 160, in which you learn something about community and tightness and the evolution of all of the emotions that we're carrying, and our sense of how we make a walk, and how it's a village, and how we really need everybody. So that's all coupled for me in that sense of grief. For grief for me is light. It's light. I'm grateful for every minute I've had with the people who are gone. And that is a lot of what the lyric essay has done for me over time. And of course, there's all that, that rewriting, the revising, the shaping, the exploring, the slicing, and swimming and jumping off cliffs and hoping you land someplace that actually makes sense in the end. So
Thank you.
Annaliese, there's a question for you in the chat as well. Barry's asking, well, he's saying, Annaliese, your essay plunges ahead at breakneck speed. How do you write at that pace?
Well, first, let me say that first of all, I'm reading at that pace. It doesn't mean that I'm writing at that pace. I mean, for me, this piece is really, I'm hoping people get it. It's an autobiography in yesterdays, and that sense of how we move forward. And once I got the pace of the yesterday, that kind of rose up for me. That was the energy that drove it. And so I'm not saying that the writing came at that same breakneck speed, but I don't know how to read that piece slowly. It might be easier to take in if I were reading it more slowly, but there's an energy that builds for me that I just feel compelled to follow once I end up speaking it. So it's much like when I said, we're going back and rewriting and revising and jumping off cliffs and maybe swimming and slicing something up. That's the writing. That's the writing of it. It doesn't move that quickly as you're laying it out on the page for me.
Someone else is asking, where is that piece in print, Annaliese?
It isn't. It isn't in print. So I write a lot, okay? And I will say that this comes from having lived on that dirt road for decades in a world in which you're not connected to that outer world of publishing and writing, and you write a lot. And as I said about those short little lyric essays that I really cut my teeth on, I didn't know they were flash lyric essays, but I was given permission to write anything, and somehow all of the extended rural communities were on for the ride, even though they didn't know what was happening to them either. So publishing is always a bit of it's a challenge for everybody, and you have to really work at that. I just love to write. So I get stuck in, it's like, no, it's not anywhere. There's the answer.
I have to say, if I could jump in for a second here, Julie, your posts about the process of sending things out and tracking submissions and rejections and percentages and all that, it inspires me. It astounds me. I think I see that on your Instagram. Is it Instagram where you post all that?
It's Instagram and Facebook. I'm glad you see it on Instagram because that's basically why I'm there. My friends were saying, like, will you please post this on Instagram because more people are there, so more people will see it. So now I'm just doing it every month at the end of the month, rather than every time there's an acceptance or rejection, like I was doing last year on Facebook, because it was so much rejection. I didn't want it to be depressing for people. So now it's a monthly summary, but I'm really glad that that's reaching you and that people have been saying that it's been helping them keep going. Even though at the same time, Annaliese, I think I really respect that feeling of just, we have to write the writing first before we can even imagine what it might be. And I think, even something I want my students to remember is, you have to write it for you first. Then you have to shape it to remember that there's an audience there, even if they're imaginary at that point. And then only then can you really choose, like, do I want to put it out there? And then when you do put it out there, if you are cataloging it in some way, you realize, wow, it is a long, slow process to find the right literary home for the work. I mean, I really hope you find the right literary home for A Life in Yesterdays, but that's just reader greed on my part. But we do, if people want to put themselves out there, there's so much rejection that I do
Right.
want to be transparent about it.
Right. I'm always astounded I've published over 1,000 things, because it's like I'm not the girl who wants to send these things out, and I will sit on things for a really long time, and something like A Life in Yesterday is like, oh, who will, yeah, the rejection. I mean, who will want that thing, that long thing, in that way? But yeah, so it is always amazing when one looks at what the work one has put out there, considering that it's such a slog trying to figure out what to do with it all. So, yeah.
I'm just scanning for more questions. Would anybody be interested in talking for a minute or so about how working within the lyric has perhaps, if you're still writing poetry, how it has perhaps affected, changed, mutated the writing? Or are you no longer writing poetry at all? Julie, do you want to?
I am writing poetry and teaching poetry, and I feel like for me, poetry is like I was right. Like my child self was right that poetry was kind of the first genre and the touchstone genre, and kind of is the first genre. So I I guess what has happened to me is not I'm writing more of everything, but caring less about what things are called than I used to. I used to be more kind of at least privately indignant if somebody referred to, like, I was very passionate. I had this book in 2016 called Six, and it's 6 long poems, and they're really experimental, and it was really, really important to me that people get that they were 6 long poems, and then this bonus shorter 7th poem that I snuck in at the end. And then people would say, like, I loved that lyric essay collection Six, and I would think like, oh, but it's poems. And then later I would think, well, why does it have to be poems? Like maybe they're poems to me and they're lyric essays to somebody else, and that's wonderful. Like it's all open. It's an open field of perception, and so if people are even thinking about genre, that's exciting. And thinking about genre like less as a cage that we put ourselves in, and more as a space that has like one of those saloon doors that just can be really flexible. And so I teach lyric essay, and I teach poetry, and I teach memoir classes, which include a lot of lyric essay. And now I teach hybrid forms, and I think they're all really related in some ways, but just going through the different doors of, when I call something this, how does it change how I see it? And so I enjoy thinking that I'm writing a poem or thinking that I'm writing a lyric essay and what that calls up for me. But then in the end, sometimes and more frequently, I feel like I don't know. And I write a lot of series. And someone had said the brilliant thing, and now I'm already forgetting who said it. It was Jill, the teacher, had mentioned the idea that what you're going to write next is always embedded in what you've written before. And so I'm finding that I'll write something and then I think, no, that's a series. Like I've got to keep going and keep going and keep going with this and play it out. But then when I go to think about publishing those things, I get really sneaky with it now. Like I'll send this out as a poem. I'll send this, like, is this a prose poem? Is this a flash lyric essay? What is this? And so I'll kind of just send it out in the world to any door that seems like it's open. And I'm finding that things are being published in places as things that I wasn't sure they were. So I'm living in sort of like this really much more open genre space than I was in 2016 when I felt I must defend these as long poems. Now I'm just happy people are reading them and having conversation about them.
I know there's a lot of questions that are coming up just as we're running out of time, but there's one that was repeated, Liz, that she'd asked earlier about Catherine had asked about how this might work with Haibun. She's interested in, the lyric essay as a road into writing the prose part of Haibun. Does anybody any of you work in Haibun? Julie, okay.
I don't want to dominate this
Take
discussion,
the
but I
last
got so
question.
excited when I heard Hi Bun. I think the lyric essay, like, people can get really into like heady conversation about like, is the Hi Bun two poetic forms in a, hybrid link where there's a prose poem on the top and a Hi Bun on the bottom? Or is it that there's this prose piece that we really want to focus on the proseness of it? And then there's this little, like, it's like a prose bicycle with a little poetic kickstand here that's the haiku. And so it's like already right there. I find myself really excited by those genre questions, like, is this a prose and poetry thing coming together, or is it two poetry things coming together? It could just as fully and truly be a lyric essay thing and a haiku coming together. I think depending on how you're thinking about what you want to do in your Haibun. But I do really want to say that as someone who's been a recent touchstone for me, Basho, obviously, I recommend reading the Narrow Road to the Interior and just everything by Basho if you can. But the contemporary writer Amy Nezuko Matato has a beautiful piece on Haibun and writing Haibun in a contemporary context at the Academy of American Poets, an essay, and then there are a couple examples of her Haibun, which are touchstones for me. And I don't think she speaks of them specifically in lyric essay terms, but she also opens up the space of not only thinking of the Haibun as like travelogue, but of also thinking of it as about like where you are. So just being where you are and noticing it differently. So having like the keen attention of a poet, which is also the keen attention of a lyric essayist, I think. And so I got interested in Haibun during the pandemic when we really couldn't go anywhere. And like, so what's right outside my window? What do I see every day? And then how does the everyday change or not change? And I think that can be a lyric essay enterprise. And I certainly don't think there's any restriction on how long the possible prose poem, possible lyric essay portion of the Haibun can be. And I also highly recommend Tamiko Bayer. Both of her poetry collections contain substantial examples of Haibun and expanded Haibun, where there's like prose or prose poetry or lyric essay, and then haiku, and then more of the prose and more of the haiku, and a stacking effect. So I would say it doesn't matter if you call it lyric essay. I would say just embrace the Haibun and dive in.
I do have to chime in that Amy Nezuko Matatel is going to be the keynote at next year's Camden's Festival of Poetry here in Camden, Maine in May. So make a plan to come to Maine next May. So thank you. Liz, do you want to take us out here?
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming together, for reading your work, and for just talking about all these ideas. I loved so much what you had to say, Julie, about genre when we're living in a world where we're cutting things finer and finer to define them. And like, what about, let's just throw it up there and we're writing and perhaps not think so much about what genre we're in. Though the idea of the lyric, it's so enticing, I think, is really the word that comes in again and again. But thank you all so much for being here with us today. Thank you for everybody who showed up and listened and commented. Thank you, Meg. And
Yeah, great reading today. I really loved all of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
yeah.
So happy to be here. Yeah.
Yeah.